and welcome to those of you joining our panel discussion today. 2020 actually ushers in a decade which the World Health Organization has designated the decade of healthy aging, as we see a dramatic shift towards an older demographic affecting populations worldwide. One of our panelists, Jens Eckstein, remarked that aging is the highest risk factor for disease, making us susceptible to myriad diseases of aging, which has really been thrown into stark and brutal relief by the ravages COVID-19 is wreaking on elderly affected individuals. So with that, it's timely for us to have this discussion about the challenges and opportunities of investing in longevity biotech. I'm joined today by four visionaries who, through their company building and investment efforts, are seeking to extend human health span. I'm going to give a brief intro to myself and the panelists, and then reserve most of our time for our discussion. So I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Stealth Biotherapeutics. My name is Reenie McCarthy. We're a NASDAQ-listed company developing mitochondrial therapeutics for diseases of aging and genetic diseases. And I was previously on the investment team at Morningside Ventures for about 20 years. I'm joined with Dr. Greg Bailey, who's the CEO of Juvenescence, very well-known name in the space. He's raised $165 million since 2017 to build a pipeline of therapeutic assets targeting aging, regeneration, and diseases of aging. Also, Dr. Laurence Barker, who's with SLSV's Dementia Discovery Fund, a £250 million fund investing broadly in adult dementias, including Alzheimer's, ALS, Huntington's, and Parkinson's. You give a wave, Laurence. And maybe you give a wave there, Greg, if you can, too. Thanks. Dr. Jens Eckstein, a 30-year veteran of the biotech industry, is the managing partner of Apollo Ventures with a mission of enhancing healthy lifespan by developing interventions to prevent or reverse age-related diseases and extend healthy human lifespan. So Jens, if you can give a nod, off video there. There you go. And finally, Dr. Xinhong is with Vickers Venture Partners, which manages $3 billion across 6 generalist global funds. Xinhong actually studied at Stanford, one of the pioneers of the Wnt signaling pathway, which probably informed Vickers' early decision to invest in SamuMed, whose Wnt pathway modulation platform makes them a leader in developing tissue-level regeneration therapies, and it's among the most highly valued healthcare startups with a $12 billion plus valuation. So I think you'll see this panel is very uniquely positioned to speak on the challenges and opportunities of investing in aging. And with that, I'd like to kick off the discussion asking our panelists, what are the major challenges that you see of investing in longevity biotech as opposed to more traditional fields? I'll ask Xinhong to take it from a pure investor perspective.
Yeah, so when we look at investments, we generally look at the balance between risk and reward. And so we drill down and ask what are the risks involved in specifically longevity and aging biotech. And I'd say probably the most outstanding risks are scientific as well as regulatory, right? In terms of scientific, I think the field has made an incredible amount of progress in terms of understanding mechanisms and markers of aging, but it's still a work in progress, and we still have plenty of work that's needed to get a much more granular understanding of how to define aging and what we need to do to modulate it, and really this question of how do we, or whether or not there's a distinction between lifespan and health span is something that I think the field is still grappling with, but getting a much better definition of. And from an investment perspective, just at least for now, it's more tractable to invest in companies that are working on so-called health span improvement, which broadly speaking could arguably cover almost all areas of therapeutics and drugs and vaccines, because they anything that improves health naturally leads to longer lives. And but it is interesting to ponder on whether or not life extension itself is something that can independently result from manipulation of the biology. And of course, the other risk that is a big one in the field is whether or not we can get the right standards and the right regulatory mechanisms in place that will enable some of these trials to be carried out in a tractable manner, especially for longevity-focused trials, which by definition are much longer because it's dealing with whether or not it helps people live longer. It's going to take a longer time. Can we, both from a scientific as well as regulatory perspective, get to an agreement on what would be appropriate markers, biomarkers that we can use to measure aging, to measure lifespan, to measure, well, we are much better at measuring health span, and use that to reduce some of the risks. So if we can address these couple of risks, I think the other risk about capitalization risk would potentially decrease because these other risks are far more significant. The market risk is right. I think, lower in the sense that everyone is susceptible.
Yep. So, so Greg and Jans, as you look to build your portfolios, thinking about longevity, thinking about health span, or thinking about diseases of aging. Jens?
Yeah, I mean, again, I come back to the thing you said in the very beginning. I think that aging is indeed the largest risk factor for disease. And I think one of the challenges is really to kind of redefine what we understand when we talk about aging and healthy lifespan. Because if we really want to, work on that concept, it's very different. The paradigm is different how we're going to approach the age-related diseases, because it's not waiting for symptoms as such as we're getting older and then treating the symptoms, but really thinking about pre-symptomatic and preventive medicine in a very, very different way. We really, the vision is, to understand what is your risk factor to develop certain diseases in age, and start bending the curve so that you don't really develop them at later stage. If you look at some of the statistics, it's really interesting. If you actually think about cancer, an enormous amount of money goes into cancer, but if you would actually be able to heal cancer, the overall life expectancy of human mankind would not go up very much, maybe 2-3 years altogether. And that is because we have polymorbidity. We usually don't have one single disease in aging, but we have several underlying problems. And I think that's the challenge, to kind of change the thinking of what you think about disease and how you treat disease. And that has challenges in both the science, how you actually apply the science, but also the business model and the economics behind it. I think it's a real new world we're looking at. And I think that's the challenge, you competing with all the other diseases and the approaches to diseases. You're competing with the way how pharmaceutical industry has done their business in the past and how they have approached their problems. And essentially, people like us, we're trying to really change the way how we think in general about growing older. I think those are very broad challenges besides just, the investment challenges.
Really interesting. Greg, you're also both investing in diseases of aging, but you've got some novel approaches to potentially pushing the needle towards aging full stop a little faster, looking at more of a nutraceutical approach in some cases. Is that right?
Yeah, we have both divisions. We have conventional RX, we have non-RX. This is a unique pathology, syndrome, process, aging. And so you have 7.8 billion people who are getting older. There's no pathology that has that sort of potential market. So all of a sudden now you can do very inexpensive IP protected products, and you don't have to have Medicare, Medi-Cal, the NHS, socialized medicine paid for it. So this changes everything going forward. So we need the RX division at Juvenescence because you need the credibility of it. And also there are tractable pathologies. And a lot of the scientists we're dealing with have both. They have a non-RX and an RX product. So this gives us a great opportunity to interact with them on both levels. But yeah, if you've got a small molecule that actually added 10 years of healthy life, you can charge £1, $1, €1, and still do very well economically.
Really interesting. Laurence, from your perspective, you're studying some diseases of aging, dementia related, that there's been a lot of effort put into development of some of those technologies. Do you think that we can learn anything from what's been learned in the Alzheimer's field or the Parkinson's field that will inform a broader approach to diseases of aging or longevity, full stop?
So yes, thanks for the question, particularly for highlighting what I think of our significant areas of overlap and cross learnings. I think if you step back up for a bit and touch on some of the things that my panelists have already alluded to, go back to some of the fundamental processes of aging, which I think are very much in common as we start to understand them better for a variety of these dementias. Then there's lots of pathways, targets, pathologies that we start to see obviously come up in both, and there's huge learnings we can take from some of these approaches that we are looking to support, particularly as we set ourselves up deliberately to throw a much wider net out there than perhaps some of the traditional approaches to, for example, Alzheimer's disease that might have been taken, to look at a range of different mechanisms that might underpin different dementias. And when we start doing that and dig more deeply, you start to come up with pathways and targets that show up as drivers for a range of these dementias. And I think many of them also are being looked at by my colleagues here who are more focused on the aging process more broadly. And we can certainly learn from those in both directions with regard to better understanding about how to drug them, how to test those in particular when we think about the drug discovery and development processes. For me, there's a lot of overlap in terms of the kind of iterative learnings and of the technological developments that we're going to be required to be successful on both fronts. And that's whether you're talking about fundamentally understanding the pathology, the biology of these diseases, the mechanisms, and then how you test them both preclinically and in particular when you think about clinical development. So there is huge overlap and learnings we can take right through the drug discovery and development process here, which we share right across the areas of either aging, research and development, or in fact of some of these specific forms of dementias. Again, back to I think a point that Jens made right at the beginning, the greatest risk factor for these also is getting older, right?
Thank you. And one last question. So what I've heard, cross-fertilization across different aging pathways, potentially leapfrogging into nutraceuticals where evidence can maybe be built post-launch to some extent. Any biomarker development, regulatory pathways, which Xinhong mentioned, any other shortcuts that we can take to elucidate these pathways, possibility of looking at rare diseases as predictive. Jens, maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a very big mission, a big vision we have, but we have to take it step by step probably. And the advantage we have is that we have the full arsenal of how we did drug development discovery in the past. And that has, really progressed quite significantly. If you can define targets, I think we have become really, really good in targeting those targets and get different modalities to actually have a biological effect. So what we're doing at Apollo is, in any of our investments, we're trying to find and dig up what we call a stepping stone disease. And that can be a genetic mutation that has an accelerated phenotype that sits on exactly the molecular mechanism that we would like to address for a broader application in age-related disease. And we will use those, and very often those are orphan diseases where you pretty much understand who your patients are because they're clearly defined by mutations or by certain accelerated phenotypes. And we will use those orphan diseases not only to help those patients, because orphan disease patients very often are in a very desperate situation, but we can use those trials then to actually find, discover, and validate biomarkers that really correlate absolutely with the biological effects. And then we can actually do the next step, because then we do not need the clear phenotype, but we can actually use those biomarkers to go into age-related disease much more broadly and also diagnose some of the things that are pre-symptomatic. So that's the overall concept of Apollo. That's why we're also pretty much specializing in building our own companies, because this is a very new approach of doing things. I think we're learning there a lot from what Laurence and his colleagues are doing in the Alzheimer's and Parkinson's field. But generally, this is kind of how we trying to figure out how to do the little steps in order to get to the bigger mission.
So we've talked a little bit about therapeutic development. What are our thoughts on gene therapy for aging? Is that aging in general, or is that age-related diseases specifically? Are any of you investing in gene therapy? Laurence, maybe?
Let me pick that up at a couple of levels. I think it certainly has a role to play with regard to some dementias. I think you really do need to ask the question up front, though, is that the right approach, the right modality, the right way to interrogate and potentially solve a genetically driven dementia? I think you have to step back and answer that and try and decide. I mean, back to Jens's point, what are you going after here? What's the approach to take? It's not the answer to all, obviously, but it certainly is with regard to some of these very clear, haploinsufficiency diseases, for example. And there are a number of companies which we've been looking at, and some which are progressing well now to using gene therapy as an approach to help solve those challenges and those insufficiencies, as it were. So yes, absolutely, and I think that field is rapidly growing in the dementias, whether that's in the ALS FTD severe, for example. I think there's several examples out there. Whether and in what way we might broaden that, I think we need to understand more about the pathology of the underlying dementias. But it is certainly growing in our field, and it's obviously not to the degree that it is in areas of oncology, but it's certainly developing.
And I think, gene therapy is interesting also because of the parallels in terms of regulatory and commercial risk, actually. I don't think the field has been able to solve the question of how to pay for it necessarily. And I can see a lot of parallels with the aging and longevity field as well. If you had a cure for aging, how might one pay for it? Nutraceuticals is a tractable way, and I think that is an interesting model to think about. Amortizing the cost of the therapy over the expected lifespan is certainly a model that people have proposed. But absolutely, to Laurence's point, it first of all has to demonstrate the efficacy. It has to be the right solution to the problem. But then we still have to figure out how to pay for it. So any groups working on this, I would really want to see and love to see how they would try to address it, and rather than sort of pushing this forward and sort of hoping and praying for the best, that the solution will come eventually, which is what a lot of groups are doing.
Time and patience. So that kind of brings up the question of who's investing in this space, given the time and patience that it takes.
Absolutely.
Is this the traditional biotech names like Fidelity's and Wellington's, or is there a different investor group that you target when you go out to fundraise for your funds? Greg, I'll let you lead that, because you may be fundraising now, actually. So
we are actually. So we're in the midst of doing a major capital raise, $100 to $150 million more. And what we've seen, we're not a fund. We're much like Jens, where he builds companies through Apollo. We actually are a pharmaceutical development company, drug development, also doing the non-RX. But a major focus is the RX. And we've seen a dramatic difference. I mean, historically, I did 2 other companies, Medivation and Biohaven, which you went to the typical, biotech investors who take their 3 to 6 months. This is happening at such a fast pace, the quality of the science, in that we had to change our model. I just didn't have the luxury to wait 3 to 6 months to raise the money. I had 7 projects to close, in June of 2018. So we went out to raise $50 million. Happily, it was oversubscribed. And it was predominantly ultra high net worths. It's an easy story for them to understand if you're able to modify aging. Back to what Jens said, about the correlation between age and every major cause of death. All 10 leading causes of death are 20 to 70 times higher at age 70 than they were at age 30. So something has changed. So if you can change that. So clearly it was seeing the ultra high net worths. The other thing is that, in this capital raise, we almost compare ourselves to Beyond Meat, just a thematic play. If you assume that Bank of America is even remotely correct, that this is going to be a $504 billion market by 2025, then, companies are going to get built that are worth $100 billion. So if you if you can appreciate the theme and you really believe that we're being able to modify aging now, science fiction is now science. And if you believe in the management team that they can execute on that, then this is a fascinating investment. And so I think we'll see thematic investors, ESG investors, as well as the ultra high net worths. And then maybe we'll back into a couple of biotech funds.
So, Xinhong, you obviously led Vickers into SamuMed, which I think you were maybe one of the earlier institutional investors in that company. Was that a departure from your typical approach? Did that take any specific, additional diligence steps for you? What was your thinking around leading that?
Yeah, so actually our strategy that has really traversed multiple industries is to really go for platform technologies where there's applicability to multiple use cases, in this case, multiple disease indications, and really going after the root cause of the challenge of the problem here. So for us, it was the innovation at SamuMed was the identification of a novel set of targets. So there's novel biology. Everyone's been trying to drug the Wnt pathway for quite a long time, with unfortunately not much success. And I've had the pleasure of having the front seat of watching a lot of that effort and trying to do it ourselves. Not much success because of all the pleiotropy and all the toxicity that's associated with it. So novel biology can significantly advance the field, and that's what I talked about at the start as well, right? So if there's a group that discovers novel biology that presents a novel way to tractably target the disease indication, especially something like this that could be so fundamental, that becomes a very attractive proposition, because then that platform potential allows us to diversify risk across multiple disease indications. In this case, going after Wnt signaling meant that they could attack both degenerative diseases, chronic diseases that had to do with the Wnt signaling gone awry. And really, our thesis, I think, has been proven correct over the years. We invested when they were preclinical. They now have 2 drugs in phase 3, several drugs completing phase 1 and moving to phase 2. So from a risk perspective, it is nice to see, or rather we prefer to invest in a company that has that sort of possibility, especially if they're going after these big, hairy, audacious goals, that they have a technology that will enable them to really take those multiple shots on goal. And then the question comes whether or not, as Greg said, this is the right team. Can they execute on this? Can they raise the capital that they need to fund those multiple shots on goal? And I have to say that the good news from the institutional side is that there's a lot more interest and appetite now in funding platform technologies. But just several years ago, I think that was really not a topic of interest at all. But now it is. And so I think our investment in SamuMed has been excellent, and is something that's whetted our appetite to invest more in various technologies in the area.
So Jens, I know you also take a platform-based approach when you incubate your companies. Is that similarly resonating with your investors in Apollo?
I mean, again, the major advantage of a bona fide platform is that you have several shots on goal. I think the challenge in platform technologies is always that you have to figure out how to keep the platform alive once you have nominated a lead program. You have to be pretty creative there, or you have to raise a ton of money. So either one works.
Yeah.
Both. But I think really, I mean, a lot of the the investments these people here on the panel are doing, they have platform character just because they fundamentally, influence aging, and that is a huge platform. So I think it will influence, so many different things. And I think it's up to us to actually not waste the value of the platforms, because I think the clinical pathways will be a challenge. It will not be easy to show biological effects in the clinic and really define the biomarkers. On the other hand, if you go directly to consumer or nutraceuticals, with time, you also want to have trials and show that you have an effect, so that you actually can have a claim on your packaging saying this will damn help you.
Absolutely.
So I think we like platforms, and it's a numbers game, because you do not rely on one single thing, but you hope that you have several shots on goal.
And I want to add is that what helped in making the case to our investment committee was really that we weren't saying that we were going after aging specifically, but that we were going after age-related diseases that, at least at the point of making the investment, it seemed like a more tractable path forward. Well-defined biomarkers, well-defined disease characteristics, a clear regulatory path forward. Of course, this is a fundamental improvement to lifespan that you could result from all these improvements. But I think having a tractable development path, a tractable route to commercialization would help to make the investment case for people considering investments in such platforms.
So Laurence, I was going to segue over to you for a minute because, harking back to Greg, who was talking about raising funding partly due to speed from non-traditional investors, high net worth individuals, maybe some tech angels. When I look at your investment consortium background, you've got more strategics who are behind you, as well as some charities and sovereign funds. So do you view that is because of the specific diseases you're targeting? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I have to say, when Greg was sharing that with us, it resonated heavily. I think it's very much driven by the area. I think if we reflected certainly back on what the traditional market view of some of the dementias, let's just pick on Alzheimer's for a minute. It is failure, and so I think when
not to pick on it too much. But
well,
right.
no, but it does characterize, I think, the way people feel about the space, or felt, I should perhaps correctly say, about the space. So to take a fund like ours out to traditional fund investors, we just weren't going to get much traction. But actually to groups, and I think this is highlighted really nicely, they have to have some sort of fundamental strategic interest. So clearly the pharmaceutical industry does, there's no doubt, but also I think, ESG impact arms of groups whose own customers are screaming out to them that they want their money to be put to work to have real impact. We certainly started to get much greater traction with those groups. And then certainly the last, and this I think resonates heavily with what Greg said, is high net worth, particularly ultra high net worth individuals or groups who want to see impact in this space much more significantly, frequently. And this was a classic story for the fundraising roadshows. They had personal or family stories, of course, in this space. Unfortunately, I think we all do. And so what we tried to do resonated heavily, and they were willing to back the team and the types of approaches that we were looking to fund. So very much resonates. And I think if we went out now to fundraise, not that we're not, but then I think it will be similar. I think through some of the developments broadly across the field, I think we're starting to see interest from groups that we previously had not. And I think the only thing that's going to further build that is of course success, and that's from my perspective clinical success. We're not there yet, but we're starting to make some I think material inroads, and that way it remains to be seen. But for now, I think we're going to be looking to non-traditional sources of finance for many of these, both as a fund level, but also actually at a company level too.
And so to that point, is it the group's consensus that it will be clinical level success that will sort of be the tipping point to bring some of the more traditional biotech names into the fold? Is that what you're seeing as well, Greg?
No, these are very smart people who have in-depth knowledge of the science, as Jens said, and the regulatory pathway. So you have to do the hybrid that's been discussed here. You have orphan drugs, a fantastic way to get things to the clinic faster, quicker, less expensive. And so they want to see that linear pathway that's been discussed on this call today. So if you can show them a path that they can digest, if it makes sense to them, if the science makes sense, then I think you can get there before having somebody definitively get a drug for anti-aging, because of the alternate pathways you can pursue. Fibrosis, inflammation, all play an enormous role in aging. Everybody understands them. The regulatory paths are pretty clear for a number of them. So we'll get there. And some of the money is being raised. I mean, there's rapamycin, which allows dogs to live 15% longer. Church's lab is working on a number of genetic modifications. And people, I think, get it, understand it, and will finance it beforehand. Having said that, the discrepancy between the amount of money that's been available towards anti-aging research and the amount of money that goes into the next social media app is a huge discrepancy. So we do need to drag those people over the fence to make them realize that this is important, and that, again, this is happening now. This is not 20 years out in the future where we're going to be literally able to modify aging, like Sanumed, like what Jens is doing.
Exactly. So, I mean, shifting to investor expectations, right? Particularly if you're going to non-traditional investors at the moment. You mentioned the next app. I mean, that's, in the blink of an eye, that's a 6 to 12 month investment cycle before you could see wild success on your investment. Do tech angels really have the stamina to weather the ups and downs and long wait times of biotech life cycles? What's your experience been with that?
They do, because, again, I think I mentioned it when we had a brief discussion before this panel. This is going to come to a shock to everyone listening in, but wealthy people want to live longer. They enjoy being wealthy. They're enjoying life. And so a lot of these tech investors have money and are wealthy people, so they'll be intrigued to invest. And that we see now with Peter Thiel. Jeff Bezos has backed a number of projects. So, yeah, the money is absolutely going to come there, but for maybe a different reason.
Yeah,
and I think the timescales are really different. I mean, I think you can make your money fairly quickly with tech. But once you have a lot of money, you have a long-term perspective suddenly. And I think that's why we see a lot of high net worth individuals coming from the tech world being interested in aging, because, they have all this money and they want to see a long life to actually take advantage of. So they're actually two very different timelines in making money versus investing the money.
And do they appreciate, Jens, your strategy of going for sort of rare diseases first as a stepping stone into more age-related diseases? Does that resonate?
I mean, I think you have to explain to them how drug discovery works. I mean, that's a difficult thing, actually. I mean, we have a lot of discussions about software beating biology. I'm on the biology camp. I think the biology is still very complicated. There are very few shortcuts, because the first thing you have to show is that whatever you do is safe, right? And that's a typical phase 1 setting you have to go through, unless you have a GRAS compound, something that's generally regarded as safe. You will have to go through that hurdle, and that is very tricky. And it takes a lot of explaining to people who do not live this every day how complicated and involved and mind-bogglingly complicated and bureaucratic it is to actually do a safety study in humans.
And so, I mean, when you're stacking, did you have a point, Greg?
Yeah, I was just going to make one other point. I mean, yes, the app gets, through very quickly, although the unicorns are sort of falling by the wayside last year at the tail end of the year. But the nice thing about biotech is there's a light switch and your stock doubles or it drops to 10 cents, on a successful phase 2 trial, phase 1 trial, which we have to educate them, and the tech investors and outside investors about this perspective. But, if you go public, if you're successful, with Medivation, we went from $1.55 a share to $324. We were the fastest rising stock on NASDAQ for 5 years in a row. So those people made money. They were incredibly successful. Similarly with Biohaven, when we've gone public, when we went public on New York Stock Exchange with that similar trajectory as you had success. And Laurence should be happy to hear our futility study in Alzheimer's was positive. So we continue forward with that, and hopefully we'll have a product for the Alzheimer's market.
That's great.
Fantastic.
So when you build portfolio companies, Jans and Greg and Laurence, as you're stacking a portfolio, do you need to think about the life cycle, where you are in your life cycle across your portfolio, so you can balance it? Does that really sort of dictate how you can invest in new technologies, because you need some things that are going to be a little bit later stage to balance out your portfolios? Maybe Laurence.
I don't think we're different than any other venture fund. I mean, and then we can have a discussion now if it makes sense to have a 10-year fund, and I think Laurence has something to say to that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I completely agree with Jens. You have to take a portfolio view. You have to look at the time you've got, the capital you've got, and how you allocate it sensibly across that for a risk and reward based on the stages of your different investments. I think to Jens's point, we did make the conscious decision that we were going to start out this fund by probably having to take some early investments and build companies from scratch, and so we decided to construct a 15-year fund from the get-go rather than anchor it at 10. Whether that was the right decision or not, well, time will tell. But I think it was more of an acknowledgement to our investors. Back to the topic we just had about explaining to people who don't work in drug discovery and development every day that these things can take time, they can be tricky, and so this was an acknowledgement that if we're going to invest in the early, target discovery, development, etc., it's going to take time, and this is an acknowledgement of that. So just almost to manage people's expectations. Ideally, we do it more quickly than that, and that's great. But I think it was just reflective of how we felt the sector and the area we were going into was.
So Greg, for you, just a quick question. Does that influence, for example, what your exit strategy will be? I mean, you're not a fund, per se, you're building a portfolio of companies. So when you think, do you think about doing licensing deals or other things to kind of pull in earlier catalysts? Does it influence your
thinking? Our job, all of us, is to deliver a return, whether to our limited partners, to our shareholders. So for this to be sustainable, it has to be top of mind. When I walk into an investor, I'm not saying, by the way, this is an amazing drug and we're going to get on the market. I am going to make you an extraordinary amount of money if I'm successful and this becomes real, because that's what their mandate is. So from day one. So we've structured in a tax beneficial jurisdiction so that we can do that. I don't think big pharma, we're never hiring 10,000 sales reps. So we're fundamentally going to be licensing after proof of concept. And so I don't think they're going to get how big the product is that Jens or I generate. They're going to think, interstitial pulmonary fibrosis, it's this market. But no, if it really does that, and if we pick the drugs well, they will have far-reaching effects. So I think we're going to end up licensing. And so, and the problem I had was with the previous company, had our first drug been successful, we would have got bought it was trading $1.3 billion, we would have bought for $4 billion. And unfortunately, the drug didn't work. So we had to keep working on our cancer drug. And instead, we were bought 3 years later for $14 billion. We would have received nothing for that drug because it was a phase 2 trial of consequence. So to structure something where I can individually parse off the various companies, as you said, in this case, there'll be therapies, and license them without having to sell the whole company is really, really important. So right from the minute when we set this up, this was the concept. And it was been my concept with the previous corporation, same situation. We can sell an individual drug without selling the product or license it. And the nice thing about doing it with a tax efficient jurisdiction with the license is you pay de minimis tax in that jurisdiction, and then you can buy shares back pro rata, so you generate long-term capital gains so your investors don't get double taxed. So to make this a successful clearly we've got to have good products, clearly they have to work, and then we have to make sure that our investors do very, very well. And by doing that, it will drive this sector forward in leaps and bounds.
Xinhong, for you, I mean, you're investing from 6 different global funds. Do you, like, how do you pick which investments to put in which fund, or if your funds have a certain lifespan, do you have any mechanism that you can essentially, share across funds? How do you approach that?
Yeah, so we are structured like a traditional VC fund, so we have a 10+2 lifespan. But fundamentally, we decided to be global from day one because we believe that innovation happens everywhere, and we need to be able to pick from the best innovation in order to to give the best returns to our limited partners. And so this was the goal from day one, to be multidisciplinary and multi-geography in terms of our interest and our focus. We have an interesting structure that's a bit different from the traditional VC fund in that we call it a bit of a phase shift in the strategy, where most VCs would actually make an investment so they would raise a fund, and then they would make investments, they would make their investments from the fund, and then they would save money for follow-ons from the same fund. And you typically can't invest across funds because there's potentially a conflict. And LPs don't necessarily like to see that. But we've structured it in a way that we actually, right from the outset, reserve about half of the fund to invest in the follow-on rounds of the most promising companies of the previous funds. And then we fully invest the rest in so-called discovery companies that are new to our portfolio. And so this enables us actually to have a long-term relationship with the company and have this longevity, especially, which is very important when investing literally in longevity companies, where there's a very long life cycle. But this enables us to have multiple funds actually participating in the company's growth, and enables us to develop a long-term relationship with the company. And so the same criteria applies. We're looking for platforms built on fundamental breakthroughs in technology that are solving huge problems, right? And so this could be in areas of clean energy, or it could be in areas such as aging and age-related diseases. So our structure actually enables us to then carry on investing multiple times in a company that's growing from strength to strength.
Really smart idea. Laurence, just back to you for one quick question. We've talked about the fact that your investor base, you do have a number of strategics. Are their expectations any different than sort of the tech angels that Greg's been speaking with, or even just the traditional biotechs? Are they looking for first dibs or first looks at technology, or is it just a straight standard investment that you see?
So two parts of that answer. We treat all, as everyone has to, all investors the same. All LPs, of course, have to be treated the same. We do give them, though, make sure they understand and see, and they also give advice to our companies on a non-confidential basis, at least initially, so that they benefit from seeing what's going on in our portfolio, but also our portfolio companies benefit from their experience, but both positively in terms of what they've managed to achieve, but also the pitfalls that they might have stumbled over, that our portfolio companies don't stumble over the same ones. So yes, we've always their capital is crucial for our fund to be successful, but also their advice, guidance, and input is something we seek as well. And we have a formal mechanism to do that, a scientific advisory board that meets several times a year to do it. But also we're very fortunate in being able to reach into those senior neuroscience leaders for advice, and we leverage that for advice for our portfolio as well. So it's more than just the capital, and that was one of the fundamental principles of when we put the fund together, was actually to be able to leverage that insight. If you have that depth of experience and around the table, we'd be foolish not to leverage it. Everyone will be foolish, because it's to our mutual success, right? But both for them and for us.
100%. So I'm going to close us out today with a final question for all of you. I mean, how do you see COVID-19 affecting, well, Greg, as you're out fundraising, the ability to fundraise in this space, or even for all of you, just investor interest? Jan's comment that we opened with, that the elderly are more susceptible to diseases of aging, also is obviously true in a pandemic situation like this. So take each of you in turn in terms of your thoughts about how the current crisis affects the field.
I'll jump in first. We've seen an enormous, unfortunate, sad effect of immunosenescence. And disproportionate number of people over the age of 70 are dying. So how do we boost the immune system? It's part of it. So I think this gives us an opportunity to refocus. And the amazing thing is, I probably could have said immunosenescence 4 years ago, and I don't think anyone would have known what the word meant. So now people are acutely aware of what the change in immunity level is. And so I think governments and investors are going to make money available for this. So that should be an enormous boost to those of us who are trying to find therapeutics. And so that's going to be a big key. Obviously, trying to raise money now is a very difficult time, because you're having to do it without meeting people, and they all want to meet the team. But I think we now have an incredibly heightened awareness of the fragility of life and the ability, when you see it, that you truly can see an mTOR or even a metformin where you can today, increases lifespan. When I tell people there's a drug today you can buy for 5p, 5 cents, that would increase your lifespan. They're astonished. So we've got the successes already.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that COVID-19 really makes everybody aware that we have been looking at disease much too focused, right? One little facet, yeah. I think what we're seeing with COVID-19, I think it's really fascinating, despite the horror of what's going on, how complicated that science is around that virus. I mean, if you now look at what comes out, looking deep into the pathology of that virus, it's really, really interesting. And I think people learn more and more that this is not a virus that has specialized on one single little thing, but has actually specialized in a systemic approach and systemic weaknesses of the human body. And that's pretty much exactly what aging is. Aging is a systemic breakdown of regulation, of fitness. And I think those things will really open people's eyes. And despite the horror of that crisis, I think it will help in generally how you look at aging and age-related disease. I think it is actually a real call to us to actually take this as a call for action.
Completely agree.
Go ahead, Laurence.
Just a brief comment, just picking up some other themes. Yes, I think it's slowed down some fundraising, some operational aspects of both our companies in terms of discovery, clinical work, and so forth. I think to look at it more positively, though, it's also reminded us how creative, flexible we can be and still get things done. So it's not impacted nearly as heavily or as made things as difficult as I thought it might across a range of our companies. People are much more creative using this type of technology, working out lab schedules. One of our companies has worked out a 24-hour lab schedule where people work and take shifts at different times of the day so they can do, 3 people in the lab and not 10, so they can keep the distancing, so they can keep things moving. I think it's encouraging people to do and be much more creative in the way they operate and the way they work. And I bet a lot of this will be lasting, even if we don't need to, because actually we're more flexible and we can achieve in a very different way, and that's a good thing. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays through.
Okay.
And I would echo everything that's been mentioned and really add that well, first of all, we have advised our companies to really batten down the hatches. We foresee challenging times continuing for a significant period ahead. We tell everyone to raise as much money as they can and to take whatever they can at this point, even given the challenging environment. The good news is that there are some sectors that are clearly benefiting from this. And I would say that healthcare, life sciences investments have never looked better, right? If there's any market that's not been as severely affected, I would say this is it. And age-related diseases, basically, investors are now looking for opportunities that are not going to be changing with the vagaries of consumer attention, right? And all sort of consumer-focused industries are suffering significantly, but investor interest has now shifted to looking at longer-term bets, things that are going to be important regardless of how whether or not we can go out and socialize. And age-related diseases certainly fall into that category as well. We at Vickers have been quite fortunate with COVID-19. We were invested in a platform of vaccines that's coming out of Oxford. working on boosting killer T cells, and training them to fight on identify infected COVID-19 cells. It's an approach that no one else has been really focused on. Everyone's been focused on stimulating antibodies to COVID-19. But as the WHO just came out and said, there is controversy over how helpful antibodies can be, and in some cases been shown to be potentially deleterious to actually worsen the severity of the disease through immune enhancement. And so a T-cell approach is fundamentally important. It's, I think, reminded the community of the importance of considering all the different shots on goal that we need to bring to bear on a particular health problem. And it's heartening to see scientists, policymakers try their best to sort of marshal their resources in a global way. It shows us how medicine and science can be done in a global fashion. And hopefully we bring the same sort of attention and effort to bear on problems of aging and age-related diseases as well.
Yeah, that's a great sentiment to end with. And as Jan said, also, multi-systemic impact of this, very similar to what happens as we age. So this has been a great discussion today. Thank you all for joining. And with that, I think our time is up, but it's been great. It's been great chatting with all of you. So thanks for making this work.